Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
Today, we're jumping into something huge, really fundamental, international politics.
Absolutely. It touches almost everything.
It really does. It's not just what you see on the news. It's like the hidden framework shaping economies, human rights, well, everything. Our world stability, basically. We've gone through a pretty hefty text. Think of it as a guide, really, breaking down the essentials. The core ideas, who the main players are, the big theories people use, and how history got us here.
It's a lot to unpack.
It is. So our mission today is simple, to give you the insights to be genuinely well-informed, to get past the headline.
To understand the why behind them.
Exactly. And let's kick off with something that always grabs them.
Yeah.
You hear this term in international relations all the time. Anarchy.
Ah, yes.
The big one. Right. And it doesn't mean chaos, like total disorder. It's something else, something foundational about how global politics works differently from, say, politics inside one country. Okay, let's get into that.
Yeah, what's fascinating here is how often anarchy is misunderstood. In this field, it simply means there's no single central government for the whole world.
No global 9/11.
Exactly. Within a country, you have police, laws, a government enforcing things. Globally, nope. There's no higher authority telling states what they must do.
So states are kind of on their own?
Pretty much. It forces them into what we call a self-help system. They have to look out for their own security, their own prosperity first and foremost. It changes everything about trust and cooperation.
Okay, so if there's no world government, no global rule enforcer,
Yeah.
who are the main players then, and what kind of are the rules of this game?
Well, the traditional primary actors are states, countries.
Right, the UK, Brazil, Japan.
Exactly. And the key concept defining them is sovereignty. That means each state has the ultimate authority within its own territory.
So other countries aren't supposed to interfere inside its borders, in theory.
In theory, yes, that's the principle of non-interference. But like you said, it gets complicated. Think human rights crises, cross-border issues, and what drives these states. Fundamentally, it's the pursuit of their national interests.
Which could be security.
Definitely security, economic well-being, maybe spreading their political ideas or influence. It varies, but self-interest is key.
But it feels like it's not just countries anymore. There are so many other groups playing huge roles on the world stage now.
Oh, absolutely. The landscape has become much more crowded. We have these crucial non-state actors.
Like who? Give us some examples.
Well, you've got the big international organizations, the UN, obviously, NATO for security, the World Bank dealing with economics. They're vital platforms.
Okay.
Then there are massive multinational corporations, an Apple, an ExxonMobil. Their economic power can be enormous, sometimes more than smaller countries.
True. And then the NGOs.
Yes, NGOs, non-governmental organizations. Think Amnesty International fighting for human rights, or the Red Cross providing aid. They wield significant influence.
And then the source also mentioned more challenging actors.
Right. Things like terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, they operate across borders with destructive aims. And even broad transnational movements, climate activists organizing globally, or international labor unions. It's a complex mix.
So many moving parts. And threading through all these interactions, you mentioned interests, but the big driver seems to be power.
Always. Power is central.
But it's not just about having the biggest military, is it? How do we break down the different kinds of power states use?
That's a key distinction. The most obvious type is hard power. That's your military strength, using economic sanctions, basically forcing others to do what you want, coercion.
To stick.
Pretty much. Then you have soft power. This is more subtle. It's about attraction, the appeal of your culture, your political values, your diplomacy, your global image.
Like Hollywood movies or maybe a country's reputation for innovation.
Exactly. It's getting others to want what you want. And the smartest approach, many argue, is smart power, a strategic blend of both. Knowing when to use persuasion and cultural influence and when perhaps harder measures are needed, it's about having a full toolkit.
Okay.
And if we connect this back, understanding these different forms of power is absolutely crucial to see how countries actually try to influence events and get their way.
So if hard power is the stick, then diplomacy must be the talking cure. the peaceful way.
Something like that. Yes, diplomacy is the primary alternative to coercion. It's managing relationships peacefully.
How does that work in practice?
It's all about negotiation, constant dialogue, hammering out treaties, building alliances. It's the day-to-day work of ambassadors, international summits, finding common ground, resolving disputes through talking.
Sounds painstaking.
It often is.
Yeah.
But it's the essential work that, when successful, prevents conflicts from escalating.
Right. Okay, so we have the actor states, NGOs, companies, we have power in its different forms, and we have diplomacy. But the world is still incredibly messy. How do people actually try to understand all this? This is where the theories come in, right? Like different glasses to view the world through?
Precisely. These major theories offer different frameworks, different explanations for why things happen the way they do.
And this is where it gets really interesting, I think, because these ideas aren't just for academics.
Yeah.
They actually influence how policymakers think and act.
They absolutely do. Let's start with the big one, realism.
Okay.
The core idea of realism is pretty stark. It sees international politics as, fundamentally, a struggle for power among states that are only looking out for themselves.
Survival of the fittest, almost.
In a way. Thinkers like Thucydides, way back in ancient Greece, Machiavelli, more recently Hans Morgenthau, they argue states are rational. They make calculated decisions living in this anarchic world we talked about.
No world government.
Right. So their number one goal is security and survival. Everything else is secondary. And because everyone is jostling for power and security, realists tend to see conflict, or at least the potential for it, as pretty much inevitable.
That sounds pessimistic.
It often is described that way. But paradoxically, realists also talk about the balance of power. The idea is that if power is distributed relatively evenly, no single state can dominate, which can actually create a kind of stability. War becomes too costly.
So peace is just a standoff.
For many realists, yes. It's not about eliminating competition, it's about managing it so things don't explode. Lasting, universal peace. They're skeptical.
Okay, that's one view. What's the counterargument?
Well, the main alternative is liberalism. This offers a much more optimistic take.
How so?
Liberals believe cooperation is possible and even likely under the right conditions. They emphasize things like international institutions, the UN, WTO, plus economic interdependence through trade, and the spread of democracy.
Key thinkers here.
John Locke, Immanuel Kant way back, and in the 20th century, someone like Woodrow Wilson.
And their core principles.
They argue that when countries trade a lot, they're less likely to fight. Why disrupt profitable relationships? International organizations can help mediate disputes peacefully. And a really big one is the democratic peace theory.
Ah, yes, the idea that democracies don't go to war with each other.
Exactly, or at least are far less likely to. So the more democracies there are, the argument goes, the more peaceful the world becomes. It's about building connections and shared values.
So realism focuses on power and conflict, liberalism on cooperation and institutions. What else?
Then we have constructivism, which offers a really different angle.
Okay.
Constructivism's core idea is that international relations aren't just determined by material things like military power or money. They're actually socially constructed.
What does that mean, socially constructed?
It means that shared ideas, norms like the norm against using chemical weapons, or the idea of human rights and even state identities, shape how states behave and interact.
So it's about beliefs and culture.
In large part, yes. Key thinkers are people like Alexander Wendt, Martha Finnemore. Wendt famously said, "Anarchy is what states make of it." Meaning, anarchy itself doesn't automatically mean a realist power struggle. If states believe they are rivals and act that way, then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But if they develop shared norms of cooperation and trust, anarchy can look very different. It raises fascinating questions about how our shared beliefs literally shape the world.
But surely military power still matters. A norm doesn't stop a tank.
Constructivists don't deny material power exists, but they argue its meaning is constructed. Think about nuclear weapons.
Okay.
The UK having nuclear weapons feels very different to North Korea having them, right?
Absolutely.
The weapons themselves are similar, but the shared history, norms, identity, and trust or lack thereof surrounding those states makes us interpret their power completely differently. It's the social context that gives power its meaning.
That's a really interesting perspective. And you mentioned one more category.
Yes. Briefly, we should touch on Marxism and critical theories. These perspectives tend to focus on the economic underpinnings.
Like capitalism.
Exactly. They look at global politics through the lens of economic inequality, historical imperialism, and how powerful capitalist states might exploit weaker ones. They often see international relations as a way for elites to maintain their dominance.
Looking beyond the state-to-state stuff to the economic system itself.
Precisely, seeing who benefits and who doesn't from the current global order.
Okay, so those are the big theoretical lenses. Now, let's get practical again. What are the actual tools or mechanisms states use to manage their relations in this complex world?
One classic mechanism is the balance of power. We touched on this with realism.
Right, keeping things stable by preventing anyone from getting too strong.
Exactly. It involves states shifting alliances, building up their own power, basically acting to counteract any rising power that threatens to dominate. The Cold War is a prime example. NATO versus the Warsaw Pact, each side constantly trying to maintain equilibrium.
Makes sense. What's the opposite of that?
That would be hegemony. This is when one single state is so powerful it dominates the international system.
Like the U.S. after World War II, maybe?
That's the most common example cited, yes. A hegemon can kind of set the rules of the game, stabilize international trade, maybe use its power to deter major conflicts. It can provide order.
But I imagine other countries might resent being dominated.
Oh, absolutely. Hegemony can create stability, but it often breeds resentment and eventual challenges to the dominant power. It's rarely permanent.
What about rules? Are there actual rules?
There is international law. This is a body of treaties, customs, and legal principles that are supposed to govern how states behave.
Like the Geneva Conventions on War.
Exactly, or the UN Charter. Rules about the sea, about trade, about diplomatic immunity. It's influential. It sets expectations and norms.
Is it enforceable?
That's the perennial question in an anarchic system. There's no world police force or global court with automatic enforcement powers. So compliance often depends on states' self-interest, reciprocity, or pressure from other states. It has limitations.
And building on that law idea, there's this concept of global governance.
Right. This isn't about a world government, but rather the complex web of international institutions, norms, and processes that allow states and non-state actors, too, to cooperate on shared problems.
Like climate change, pandemics.
Precisely. Issues that no single country can solve alone. Think of the World Trade Organization managing trade rules, or the UN Security Council trying to address threats to peace. It's about collective problem solving, even without a central authority.
It sounds like a constant negotiation.
It really is a constant effort to coordinate action among sovereign states with often competing interests.
Okay, so let's pull the lens back even further. How did we actually arrive at this current state of affairs? What's the historical evolution been like?
Well, if you go back before the 20th century, the world looked very different. It was largely dominated by empires, European empires, primarily expanding colonies, competing fiercely for territory and resources across the globe.
A very Eurocentric world order.
Largely, yes. Then the 20th century brought massive upheavals. 2 world wars completely reshaped the power balance.
Leading to the Cold War.
Exactly. Which created a bipolar system, the U.S. and the Soviet Union as the 2 superpowers, locked in ideological and geopolitical struggle. Alongside this, we saw huge decolonization movements.
So lots of new countries emerging.
Dozens of new states gained independence, fundamentally changing the membership of the international community and adding new voices and interests.
Then the Cold War ends.
And we enter the post-Cold War era. Around 1990, many called it a unipolar moment, with the U.S. as the undisputed dominant power.
A time of optimism for some.
Yes, there was a surge in globalization, the spread of democracy and market economies seemed ascendant, international institutions grew stronger.
But that moment didn't last forever.
No. Now, in the 21st century, things look different again. We're seeing the clear rise of China, a move back towards multipolarity, multiple centers of power.
And a return of competition.
Definitely a return of great power competition. Plus, new kinds of threats have become central, transnational terrorism, climate change hitting hard, cyber warfare becoming a major tool, and, as we all experience, global pandemics.
So that brings us pretty much up to today. What does all that history tell us about where we are right now?
It tells us we're in a period of significant flux and challenge. Looking at the major contemporary issues, that great power rivalry is impossible to ignore.
U.S. versus China is the big one people talk about.
It is. Across trade, technology competition, disputes over Taiwan, actions in the South China Sea. It's multifaceted. And also, the Russia-West conflict is critical of the war in Ukraine. Arguments over NATO expansion, energy politics playing a huge role. Reporting these impartially, understanding all sides is key.
Absolutely. What other big issues are defining today?
Well, nuclear proliferation remains a serious concern. Worries about North Korea's arsenal, Iran's nuclear program potentially restarting, maybe arms races simmering in South Asia. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, feels under strain.
And climate change.
Climate change and environmental security are right at the top of the agenda for global diplomacy. You see efforts like the Paris Agreement trying to coordinate action.
But it's hard, right, getting everyone on board.
Extremely hard, because cutting emissions impacts economies differently, and national interests often diverge, making collective action a massive challenge despite the shared threat.
What about the digital world?
Huge. Cyber warfare and information politics. We're talking state-sponsored hacking, espionage, massive surveillance programs, and disinformation campaigns designed to sow discord or influence elections. It's a battleground involving states like Russia, China, the US, but also non-state groups.
Constantly evolving, too.
Constantly. And finally, an issue with profound human impact: migration and refugees. Millions are displaced by conflict, instability, and increasingly climate change.
Creating huge dilemmas for country.
Exactly. How do you balance humanitarian obligations with concerns about national security and social cohesion? It's a tough balancing act for nearly every nation.
So, looking out from these current challenges, what are the big future trends people are watching?
Well, that shift towards multipolarity seems pretty locked in. A world with several major power centers, the US, China, the EU bloc, India, perhaps others, all navigating complex relationships.
Which leads to the question about America's role.
Right. The debate around the decline of U.S. hegemony. Is its dominant position waning due to internal issues or the rise of others? What does that mean for global stability if there isn't one clear leader? It's hotly debated.
And technology keeps marching on.
For sure. AI and tech geopolitics is a massive emerging area. Rivalry over semiconductors, who controls artificial intelligence development, debates over surveillance tech. This is a new frontier of competition.
We're also seeing shifts in the developing world.
Yes, the global South's rise. Developing countries, often grouped in forums like BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now others, are demanding a greater say in how the world is run, challenging established structures.
And you mentioned this seeming contradiction.
Yeah, this fascinating tension between fragmentation versus integration. At the same time that globalization connects us deeply, you also see forces pulling things apart: rising nationalism, regional blocs strengthening, trade wars. Which trend will dominate is a huge question mark.
So much to keep track of. If listeners want to dig even deeper into the foundational ideas, are there any classic books you'd recommend?
Absolutely. For understanding power politics, you can't really beat Machiavelli's The Prince, still relevant after centuries. For classic realism, Hans Morgenthau's Politics Among Nations is a cornerstone. John Mearsheimer's The Tragedy of Great Power Politics is a more recent, very influential take.
Okay.
And for a slightly different, more structural view of realism, Kenneth Waltz is essential. His books Theory of International Politics and Man, the State, and War really shape the field. Reading these gives you a much richer grasp of the core debates.
Great recommendation. So, as we wrap this up, it's just so clear that international politics is, it's messy, it's constantly changing.
It really is. It's this complex dance between power, state interests, competing ideas, and the institutions they've built.
And all these interactions, they're not abstract. They shape our daily lives, don't they?
Yeah.
Our jobs, our security, human rights, the environment.
Everything. From the price of gas to the possibility of peace, it's all interconnected through these global dynamics.
Okay, so here's a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. We've talked about these huge transnational threats: climate, cyber attacks, pandemics that require cooperation. But we also see fragmentation and rising nationalism. So the question is, what new kinds of international cooperation do you think are most urgently needed today? And crucially, why might they be so incredibly difficult to actually achieve?
That's a really good question to ponder.
It is. Something to think about. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the complex world of international politics.
My pleasure.
And we really encourage you to keep digging into this topic. It matters. Thanks for listening.